So thank you so much, Dwaipayan. It's really nice to have you present at this seminar. And it's fantastic to see such a large turnout for your seminar as well. We're very much looking forward to this conversation and to your paper because comparisons between caste and race have been long running. And we're looking forward to your discussion of these comparisons. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to present in this forum and to those in the audience who are here today. The paper is less a coherent agenda of research than a series of reflections that have been with me for some time now, concerning two questions I believe could contribute to the agenda of this seminar series. One, what were the historical conditions of possibility that enabled the comparison between race and caste in the first place? And two, what was actually at stake when historical actors actually began to put these conceptual fields in conversation with the other? I believe that how one chooses to answer these questions has some bearing on the present predicament and that old and eternal question, what is to be done? I should mention, by way of caveat, that I am speaking primarily in my capacity as a historian of caste and casteism in the context of the modern South Asian past. I shall draw attention to a number of ironies, social, theoretical, and historical, as well as the historical contextual specificities that have accompanied what I am calling uncanny juxtapositions. I propose that to compare race and caste in the service of activist politics is to run the risk of a powerful, if productive, analytical imprecision whose effectiveness is determined by what the other category means to a given audience in the historically specific context of their place and time. I will argue that such comparisons of necessity, indeed constitutively, rest on quote unquote inaccuracy and a generative misreading. I'm suggesting that the concerns for analytical fealty that have featured so centrally in academic discussions, as germane as they may be, are oddly misplaced when it comes to the question of global and activist solidarities. It seems to me that this distinction between scholarly and or intellectual understanding of the affinities or lack thereof between race and caste and the explicitly political and or activist gesture of drawing the two together in the service of transnational commensurability may be worth bearing in mind in the discussion of these themes. Indeed, the dichotomy may in fact be an expression of the scholarly impulse towards differentiation as against the activist concern to seek commonality in resemblance. Now, of course, one might start with the striking observation that in any number of Indian vernaculars, caste always meant or certainly anticipated what we have come to recognize as race. Before what the historian Sanjay Subramaniam has termed the Indo Portuguese moment gave rise to the availability of the concept of kashta, terms like jati or varna, if but etymologically, were coextensive with the botanical, zoological, and certainly typological reference to which that Iberian term attached. Kashta was used by early European travelers as an ambiguous term for community, bloodline, or birth group, concepts that themselves emerged from the late medieval and early modern Lusophone imperial historical conjuncture. To wit, one might say, in a certain sense, caste and race actually meant the same thing, and indeed arguably still do, and issued forth as ideas due to the activities of a vast range of historical forces: imperialism, proselytization, capitalism, cross cultural comparison, and the birth of the human sciences. The comparison of race and caste, in short, was a function of the gradually increasing circulation of people's ideas, institutions, and practices characteristic of the early modern epoch. The gradual centuries long dissociation, disentangling, and stabilization of the meaning of these terms was a process, I would argue, that again, ironically, produced the very conditions for comparison. While I don't have the time to elaborate on how the impulse to universality helped produce the particularities of societies, central to this unfolding was a systematic misrecognition that one might say remains with us today as well, and lies at the heart of the possibility I am proposing we consider. I will illustrate what I mean by recourse to a number of key moments in the history of this comparison. Jyotiba Phule's dedication in his revolutionary tract Gulamgiri, or slavery, Oliver Cromwell Cox's engagements with the caste concept, Dalit activists' attempts to include caste discrimination on the agenda of the World Conference Against Racism at the turn of the century, and finally, Isabel Wilkerson's recent book, Caste, the Origins of Our Discontents. So one might say that Phule, the most significant anti-caste thinker and activist in late 19th century Western India, in important ways inaugurates the tradition of explicit comparison between the plight, a crucial conceptual innovation itself, of African American and Dalit lives in the Indian context. Gulamgiri, or slavery, his most well known text, was the product of his interlocution with British colonial law, missionaries in Western India, and of course, his rebellion against the regionally specific nature of caste hierarchy and practice within his milieu. Phule famously dedicated his text that sought to persuade the British colonial government, that sought to persuade that British colonial government was effectively sanctioning slavery in its enabling of Brahmin dominance to the citizens of this great republic. The quote is as follows: "To the good people of the United States, as a token of admiration for their sublime, disinterested, and self sacrificing devotion in the cause of Negro slavery, and with an earnest desire that my countrymen may take their noble example as their guide in the emancipation of the Shudra brethren from the trammels of Brahmin thraldom." End quote. While I've always been struck by the critical mistake in the first part of this dedication, the in the cause of Negro slavery, you might think in the cause of the abolition of slavery. What I've actually long pondered is the phrase sublime, disinterested, and self-sacrificing devotion. And why? Not only do I wonder about how Phule imbibed such fanciful notions, but also about what it suggests about the gesture of dedication itself. This is the point, it seems to me. As generations of debate by historians of the African American past have conclusively proved, it was by no means the abolitionists who took the lead in ending slavery. It was first and foremost slaves themselves. The good people of the United States were by and large only too content to benefit from the unpaid labor of that peculiar institution. Moreover, when it was called into question, responded with Jim Crow. That they were sublime, disinterested, and self sacrificing is nothing but a myth, and one might argue might have been deeply offensive to the sensitivities of those who bore the ongoing burden of the color line in 1873, the year the book was published. Let's turn now to Oliver Cromwell Cox and his moment. The ironies abound. Not only did his generation of civil rights activists visit India to meet Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi because they believed fundamentally that he had revolutionized Hindu conscience against casteism, but further that Gandhi's methods in this particular respect could be of use to appealing to the American conscience in their struggles, in their own struggles at home. equally offensive, one might add, from contemporary Dalit perspectives. Be that as it may, I have no doubt that the idea of caste served an absolutely crucial analytic for this generation of African American thought and performed an immense theoretical work that, in my view, is yet to be adequately mapped. I have always been struck by how many times, for instance, W.E.B. Du Bois speaks of caste in his Souls of Black Folk. A quick scan through his archive produces nearly 100 references to the term caste. Du Bois wrote essays, for instance, with titles like Caste in America, and intervened powerfully in a debate surrounding Buell G. Gallagher's study, American Caste and the Negro College. Now, Cox, a prominent sociologist of his generation, famously was of the school that believed using caste to understand race and racism in this country was inappropriate because of what they believed was the static and rigid nature of a system that ultimately rested on what they understood to be the compliance of untouchables. As many South Asianists will immediately recognize, such understandings of caste as essentially an order constitutionally unable to accommodate dynamism, change, and mobility was a figment of imagination. Historical evidence of precisely these dimensions of social change abound in Indian history. As the historian and anthropologist Susan Bailey argued, in what remains arguably the most compelling account of caste in early modern and modern India, caste is a quote dynamic and multidimensional reality of Indian life, rather than an Orientalist fiction or monolithic cultural code. End quote. There is, moreover, the problematic myth of Dalit compliance to the caste order that was, as numerous researchers have demonstrated, repeatedly challenged and subverted. But that is precisely my point. In a sense, it does not matter that observers or analysts of one social form misrecognize the other, whether in affirmation or critique. These uncanny juxtapositions were powerful because they were, strictly speaking, wrong. Indeed, there is tremendous value in such productive misreadings because they throw into relief the dynamics of each social system and enable the possibility of transcultural and transnational solidarities against forms of social oppression. This aspect of the comparisons between race and caste was on robust display in the subsequent example I consider, namely the efforts by Dalit activists associated with the national campaign on Dalit human rights in 2001 to argue at the United Nations World Conference Against Racism that caste and casteism could be regarded as a species of race and racism, and as such should be considered within the ambit of the conference proceedings. The National Campaign for Dalit Human Rights, NCDHR, came to Durban demanding recognition of caste-based discrimination in the conference declaration. Velupan Karupan, an NCDHR leader, um, stated that as a Dalit, you cannot take water from the general well. You have to take it from a separate well. You cannot bury a Dalit's dead body in the common place. You have to use a separate burial ground. Gesturing toward a companion named Shekhar, Karupan observed that he cannot enter into the temple even though he is a Hindu. We have been deprived of all the facilities which a human citizen should have, Shekhar added. I don't have citizenship rights in my country. I don't take water in the public place. I don't walk in the public streets. They're prohibited. So what citizenship rights do I have? End quote. The Dalit caucus arrived in Durban with a formidable publicity army of more than 200 representatives. By the time the official conference opened, NGO delegates and journalists from all over the world were sporting vests, shirts, stickers, and buttons with the slogan include caste in WCAR. But widespread popular support and a great deal of sympathy from the international press were not enough to counter the international clout of the Indian government and the game of diplomatic hardball it played. In the months before the conference, the Indian delegation dominated drafting committees and threatened economic pressure against other countries in its campaign to keep caste off the agenda. Human Rights Watch, other NGOs, and a dissenting Indian member of parliament present at the Geneva preparatory meeting in August characterized the behavior as sabotage. Upon arrival in Durban, India's resistance only hardened. Though UN Secretary General Kofi Annan made a point of referring to victimization based on dissent in his opening speech to the conference plenary, the Indian government consistently condemned any attempt by the United Nations to address the issue. Resistance to the notion that caste and casteism be considered within the ambit of the conference did not, however, issue solely from governmental circles. The matter had unleashed heated debate in the Indian public sphere, with prominent sociologists Andre Bete and Dipankar Gupta taking a stand against the comparison. In a series of editorials, they maintained that sociologically speaking, caste was not the same as race, even if they tacitly affirmed that the matter may be taken up at the conference itself. In the context of efforts by Dalit activists to internationalize the issue of caste prejudice, their positions were perceived, one might say erroneously, to dovetail with that of the government of India. One thus observed, yet once more, this split between activists' pleas that caste and race be regarded as comparable and a more conservative academic and governmental stance that they be understood as distinct and incommensurable social phenomena. My final example comes from the recent publication in response to the author Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, the Origins of Our Discontents. Wilkerson's premise was that caste in the context of the United States, Wilkerson's premise was that race in the context of the United States of America was in essence about caste. That was an interesting slip. Though through arresting anecdote, compelling journalistic observation, and a globalized view of what Du Bois called the problem of the color line, she sought to convince that the discourse and practice of race in the USA was in actuality an expression of caste and casteism. While much of the response in the public domain was appreciative, scholarly appraisal fell short of the enthusiasm with which the work had been received in non-academic circles. Indeed, in my own estimation, there are a number of significant issues where the analogies between race in the USA and caste in India seem strained. Consider, for instance, the substantial differences between the playing out of these social forms with regard, for instance, to intermarriage, affirmative action programs, or even the precise expressions of anti-Black and anti-Dalit violence and resistance. To recall an event fresh in collective memory, it is inconceivable that a movement on the scale and scope of what was witnessed in the wake of George Floyd's murder would develop in India in response to the routine killing of a Dalit man. Another kind of aspect that has always struck me is that the degree of institutional support in the US for the study of race, for example, and the study of African American lives, compared to the degree of institutional support in India for the study of caste or for the study of Dalit lives. I mean, there's no comparison whatsoever. Um, so the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai's response was telling. In a review essay in The Wire titled Comparing Race to Caste is an Interesting Idea, but there are crucial differences between both, Appadurai asked a series of quite germane questions. Quote, my question is this: if caste in the US is a kind of code which is buried deep under the surface of race and of the brutal etiquette uh, and of the brutal etiquette and institutions of race and racism, how can we compare it to a society like India, where caste is both the code and the everyday reality? Put another way, either India has no underlying social program, grammar, and theory, and its social world is simply caste all the way up and down, something I doubt, or Wilkerson's dramatic unearthing of caste under the surface of race in the US is just a literary device to tell a familiar American story in an unfamiliar way and is not based on genuine similarity. End quote. Likewise, albeit with a different argumentative thrust, the political scientist Charisse Burden Stelly's evaluation in the Boston Review rejected the analogy in a piece bluntly titled, Caste Does Not Explain Race. The nub of her reservations was captured in the following view. Wilkerson's, quote, dismissal of any analysis of racial capitalism and the descriptive assessment of caste instead offers a decontextualized, ahistorical, and inaccurate description of racial antagonism, caste, and class. Wilkerson's emphasis on caste makes no mention, let alone critique, of capitalism. The word does not appear once in the text. End quote. Nothing of what I've stated should be taken to imply that one is not disarmed by what resemblances undoubtedly exist and have existed between race and caste. Black lives matter, Dalit lives matter. Racism and casteism, as distinct from race and caste, both seem to issue from a broadly similar will to dehumanize and rob a person of social value to produce a kind of social death. But equally, Mississippi is not Maharashtra. Lynching is not atrocity. Reservations are not affirmative action. Even as one cannot turn from the moral imperatives of imagining the emergent commensurabilities of politics, one must equally attend to differences and specificities. The problems I've described are, it might be worthwhile to note, intrinsic to the gesture of comparative transnational and connected histories themselves. As I've tried to suggest, race as caste or caste as race inaugurates suggestive and uncanny juxtapositions, even as they remain, at least in the mind of collective academic opinion, much too distinct social phenomena, unamenable to meaningful comparison. It seems unlikely that such divisions between scholarly and activist estimation will be bridged in the foreseeable future. Thank you very much. Sorry, I can't hear you, Humayun.
Thank you very much. This was perfectly timed. And I know there are a lot of questions, so we'll begin with those.